wind howled across the prairie, carrying with it a secret older than the grass itself. In the shadow of Devil's Nest Bluff, the land seemed to breathe, the limestone cliffs rising like the bones of some ancient beast, half-buried and restless. The settlers who came to Keokuk County in the spring of 1856 did not know the stories, not at first. They saw only the promise of rich soil and a place to build their futures. But the prairie had its own memory, and the bluff watched them with cold, patient eyes. Subscribe, if you dare. But be warned, some stories don't stay buried. The first sign was the preacher. He arrived on a Sunday, his horse lathered and wild-eyed, his coat torn by thorns. He was a stranger, his accent thick and his eyes haunted by sleepless nights. He called himself Reverend Elijah Crane, and he carried with him a battered Bible and a warning. The settlers gathered in the half-built meeting house, the walls still open to the wind, and listened as he spoke of devils and secrets buried beneath the limestone. "There is a darkness in these cliffs," he said, his voice trembling. "A devil that feeds on the living and the dead. It waits for those who do not heed the old boundaries." Some laughed, but others shifted uneasily, glancing at the bluff where the sun never seemed to shine quite right. The preacher's words lingered in the air long after he left. He did not stay in the settlement, but made camp at the edge of the woods, close enough to watch but far enough to keep his distance. The children whispered about him, daring each other to creep close to his fire at night. The adults tried to ignore him, but his warning gnawed at their sleep. The dogs, usually bold and eager, would not go near the bluff. They whined and pulled at their tethers, eyes fixed on the cliffs as if they saw something the humans could not. On the third night, a storm rolled in from the west, black clouds boiling over the prairie. Lightning split the sky, and the wind screamed through the cabins, rattling the shutters and slamming doors. The settlers huddled together, listening to the preacher's voice rise above the storm, chanting words none of them understood. In the morning, the air was heavy and still. The ground soaked and the grass flattened as if something enormous had passed through in the night. It was then that the children found the first sign. Near the base of the bluff, where the limestone jutted from the earth like broken teeth, they discovered a circle of stones blackened and warm to the touch. In the center, a small wooden idol, its face worn smooth by time, stared up at the sky with empty eyes. The preacher saw it and fell to his knees, weeping and praying in a language none of them recognized. The settlers argued about what to do. Some wanted to burn the idol, others to bury it. In the end, they left it where it was, too afraid to touch it. That night, the dogs began to howl. Their cries echoed across the prairie, sharp and desperate, until one by one they fell silent. The settlers lay awake, listening to the wind and the distant sound of the preacher's prayers. In the morning, they found the dogs tied up and starving, their eyes wild with fear. The preacher was gone from his camp, his fire cold and his Bible left open to a page stained with something dark and sticky. The days passed in uneasy silence. The settlers tried to go about their work, but the land seemed to resist them. Tools broke, crops withered, and the air grew thick with the scent of rot. At night, strange lights flickered on the bluff, and the children dreamed of voices whispering from the stones. The preacher returned, his face gaunt and his eyes sunken, and warned them again. "You must not disturb the earth here," he said. "There are things beneath the soil that remember." But the settlers were desperate. The winter had been hard, and their stores were running low. When one of the men found a mound near the bluff, half hidden by grass and wildflowers, they saw only the promise of what might lie beneath. They dug with shovels and bare hands, breaking through the earth to find bones, beads, and fragments of pottery. The preacher begged them to stop, but they would not listen. They unearthed a skull, its jaw twisted in a silent scream, and a mask carved from wood, its features warped and blackened by age. That night, the wind died. The prairie was silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the soft, frantic prayers of the preacher. The settlers gathered in the largest cabin, the mask lying on the table between them. They argued about what to do, their voices rising in fear and anger. The preacher pleaded with them to return the mask, to bury the bones and beg forgiveness. But pride and hunger won out. They locked the mask in a chest and tried to forget. In the morning, the settlement was empty. The cabin stood silent, the doors hanging open, the food still warm on the tables. The dogs were tied up and starving, their bodies trembling with fear. In the meeting house, a torn hymnal lay on the floor, its pages soaked in a strange black liquid that smelled of earth and decay. There was no sign of struggle, no footprints in the mud, no blood. Only the silence, heavy and absolute. The preacher and the 9 settlers were never seen again. The prairie swallowed their names, and the bluff watched in silence, its secrets safe for another season. But the land remembered, and the wind carried their story, a warning to those who would not heed the old boundaries. Years later, a diary would be found, its pages brittle and stained, telling of what they had done and what they had awakened. But that is a story for another night, when the wind howls and the prairie remembers. And so the vanishing at Devil's Nest Bluff began, with a warning, a storm, and a secret buried beneath the soil. The land waits, patient and hungry, for those who do not listen. The prairie did not forget. In the weeks that followed the vanishing, the land around Devil's Nest Bluff grew wild and unruly, as if the grass itself recoiled from the memory of what had happened. The cabins, left to the mercy of wind and rain, sagged and rotted, their doors banging open and shut in the night. The dogs, once loyal and eager, were found by a passing trapper, their bodies thin and wasted, eyes fixed on the bluff as if still waiting for their masters to return. The trapper, a man named Harlan Pike, was the first outsider to stumble upon the scene. He found the food on the tables, cold but untouched, and the torn hymnal, its pages stuck together with that strange black liquid. He did not linger. He took what he needed, salt, flour, a battered tin cup, and left before the sun set, muttering prayers under his breath. Word spread slowly, carried by travelers and traders who skirted the bluff with wary eyes. The story changed with each telling. Some said the settlers had been taken by Indians, others that they had quarreled and killed each other, their bodies buried in shallow graves. But those who had seen the place, who had smelled the rot in the air and felt the weight of the silence, knew better. There was something wrong with the land itself, something that watched and waited, patient as stone. In the months that followed, no one dared settle near the bluff. The grass grew tall and thick, hiding the mounds and the broken fences. The cabins became nests for crows and wildcats, their windows black and empty. At night, travelers on the old wagon road claimed to see lights flickering on the bluff, pale and cold as moonlight. Some heard singing, a thin, wavering sound that rose and fell with the wind. Others spoke of shadows moving among the stones, shapes that did not belong to any living thing. It was in the autumn of that year that the first journal was found. A group of hunters, lost in a sudden storm, took shelter in the largest cabin. They found the diary beneath a loose floorboard, its cover stained and warped by damp. The writing inside was cramped and hurried, the ink faded but still legible. It belonged to a woman named Abigail Finch, one of the vanished settlers. Her words were a record of fear and hope, of daily life on the edge of the unknown. The first entries were ordinary enough, accounts of planting corn, mending clothes, and tending to the sick. But as the days passed, a note of unease crept into her writing. She wrote of the preacher's arrival, of his warnings and his strange, fevered prayers. She described the idol found at the base of the bluff and the arguments that followed. "The men do not listen," she wrote. "They say the preacher is mad, but I have seen the way the dogs cower, the way the children wake screaming from dreams they cannot remember." Abigail's words painted a picture of a community unraveling. The crops failed, the well soured, and the nights grew longer and colder. The settlers quarreled over food and firewood, their tempers fraying like old rope. The preacher, once a figure of authority, became a source of fear and suspicion. Some claimed he brought the curse with him, that his prayers were not for salvation but for something darker. Others clung to him, desperate for any hope, any explanation for the misfortunes that plagued them. The diary spoke of the burial mounds, of the day the men dug into the earth and found the bones and the mask. Abigail wrote of the preacher's terror, his pleas to leave the dead undisturbed. "He says we have broken a covenant," she wrote, "that the land remembers, and it will not forgive." She described the mask in detail, its wood blackened and cracked, its features twisted in a silent scream. "It is a thing of nightmares," she wrote. "I cannot sleep with it in the house. I hear it whispering in the dark." The last entries grew frantic, the handwriting jagged and uneven. Abigail wrote of voices in the night, of shadows moving outside her window. She wrote of the preacher's sermons, now little more than rants against the darkness. "He says the devil lives in the bluff, that it waits for us to falter. I do not know what to believe. I am so afraid." The final entry was little more than a scrawl. "The wind is singing. The dogs are silent. Something is coming." The hunters who found the diary left it where they found it, too frightened to take it with them. They told their story in the nearest town, and soon the legend of Devil's Nest Bluff grew. People spoke of the vanished settlers in hushed tones, of the preacher who warned of devils and the curse that followed. Some claimed to have seen Abigail's ghost, wandering the prairie in her nightdress, her face pale and her eyes empty. Years passed, and the bluff remained untouched. The grass grew higher, the cabins collapsed, and the burial mounds sank back into the earth. But the stories did not fade. Children dared each other to spend a night on the bluff, and old men warned of the curse that lingered in the stones. Some said the land itself was hungry, that it demanded a price for every secret unearthed. In the winter of 1862, a group of railroad surveyors camped near the bluff. They laughed at the stories, dismissing them as frontier superstition. But on the third night, one of their number vanished without a trace. His boots were found at the edge of the bluff, his footprints leading into the tall grass and ending abruptly. The others left at dawn, their faces pale and their voices hushed. The land around Devil's Nest Bluff grew wild and empty, a place shunned by man and beast alike. But sometimes, when the wind was right, the singing could still be heard, thin and mournful, rising from the stones, and those who listened too closely found themselves dreaming of blackened masks and empty eyes, and of secrets that should have stayed buried. The prairie silence was a living thing, thick and watchful, as if the land itself was holding its breath. In the years after the vanishing, the story of Devil's Nest Bluff became a shadow that stretched across Keokuk County. Farmers who worked the fields nearby would not look toward the limestone cliffs after sundown. Children were warned to keep away from the tall grass, and even the bravest dogs would not cross the invisible line where the wildflowers grew too thick and the air tasted faintly of iron. Yet the story would not rest. In the spring of 1864, a traveling peddler named Jonas Bell arrived in the county, his wagon creaking under the weight of pots, pans, and trinkets. He was a man who prided himself on his skepticism, a collector of stories and oddities, and he had heard the tale of the vanished settlers in every town from Ottumwa to Oskaloosa. He scoffed at the warnings, dismissing them as the inventions of frightened minds. But curiosity gnawed at him, and one evening, as the sun bled red behind the bluff, he set out to see the place for himself. Jonas found the remains of the cabins half swallowed by grass, their roofs caved in and their walls leaning at drunken angles. The air was heavy with the scent of wild sage and something older, a sourness that clung to the back of his throat. He picked his way through the ruins, noting the scattered bones of small animals, the rusted hinges, the broken glass. In the largest cabin, he found the hearth still blackened with soot, and in the ashes, a single page from a hymnal, its words blurred and stained with a dark, oily residue. He pocketed the page, thinking to show it to the next preacher he met, and wandered toward the bluff. The limestone cliffs loomed above him, their faces pitted and scarred by centuries of wind and rain. At their base, the grass grew in strange, swirling patterns, as if something had twisted it from below. Jonas knelt to examine the ground and found a circle of stones, half buried and cold to the touch. In the center, a depression in the earth, as if something heavy had once lain there and been removed. As dusk deepened, Jonas felt the air grow colder. The wind died, and the prairie seemed to press in around him, muffling every sound. He stood, brushing dirt from his hands, and turned to leave. That was when he heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like bone on stone, coming from somewhere deep within the bluff. He froze, heart pounding, and listened. The sound faded, replaced by a low, mournful singing that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The words were indistinct, but the melody was old, older than any hymn he had ever heard. Jonas fled, stumbling through the grass, not stopping until he reached his wagon. He did not sleep that night, and when dawn came, he found the page from the hymnal had turned black, the ink running like fresh blood. He left Keokuk County that morning, never to return, but he told his story in every town he passed. Some laughed, others crossed themselves, but all agreed that the bluff was a place best left alone. The legend grew, fed by fear and the unknown. In the summer of 1867, a group of young men from a nearby town dared each other to spend a night on the bluff. They brought whiskey and lanterns, their laughter echoing across the prairie as they made camp near the old burial mounds. As the night deepened, the wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and something fouler. The lanterns flickered, casting long, twisted shadows across the stones. One of the men, a farmhand named Samuel, wandered away from the group, drawn by a whispering voice that seemed to call his name. He found himself standing before a mound, the earth freshly turned as if something had clawed its way out. He knelt, reaching out to touch the soil, and felt a sudden icy pain shoot up his arm. He staggered back, clutching his wrist, and saw that his hand was stained black, the skin puckered and raw. The others found him at dawn, shivering and delirious, his eyes wide with terror. He spoke of voices in the earth, of hands reaching up to drag him down. He would not speak of what he had seen beneath the soil, but his hair turned white within a month, and he never set foot near the bluff again. The townsfolk took this as a sign. They gathered in the church, praying for deliverance, and sent word to the nearest reservation, seeking the counsel of the Sauk elders. An old man came, his face lined with age and sorrow, and listened to their fears. He walked the edge of the bluff, scattering tobacco and singing in a language none of them understood. When he returned, he spoke quietly, his words heavy with warning. "This place is not yours," he said. "The earth remembers. The dead remember. Leave them to their rest, or the land will take what it is owed." The settlers listened, and for a time the bluff was left alone. The grass grew higher, the stones sank deeper, and the wind carried only the sound of birds and the distant lowing of cattle. But the story lingered, a wound that would not heal. Travelers still spoke of the vanished settlers, of the preacher who warned of devils, and of the blackened mask that whispered in the dark. And sometimes on nights when the moon was thin and the wind was still, the singing could be heard again, rising from the stones, calling out to those who dared to listen. The years crept by and the prairie's wounds healed over, but the memory of Devil's Nest Bluff festered beneath the surface. The land was left to itself, the grass growing wild and the stones sinking deeper into the earth. Yet, the story of the vanished settlers and the preacher's warning was never far from the lips of those who lived nearby. It was a tale told in low voices around winter fires, a lesson for children who wandered too close to the edge of the world. In the autumn of 1871, a new family arrived in Keokuk County. The McCraes were drawn by the promise of cheap land and the hope of a fresh start. They were a sturdy, practical people, unbothered by superstition. John McCrae, the patriarch, laughed off the warnings of the townsfolk. "Ghost stories for children," he said, waving away the old men who tried to dissuade him. His wife, Martha, was less certain. She noticed the way the locals crossed themselves when they spoke of the bluff, the way their eyes darted to the horizon as if expecting something to rise from the grass. The McRaes built their cabin on the edge of the old settlement, using timbers scavenged from the ruined homes. Their children, 2 boys and a girl, explored the prairie with the reckless curiosity of youth. They found the remains of the old cabins, the stones of the fire pits, and the half-buried circle near the bluff. The youngest, Sarah, brought home a bead of red stone she found in the grass, and Martha scolded her, making her return it to the earth. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Martha began to feel the weight of the land pressing in around her. The wind seemed to carry voices, faint and pleading, and the shadows at the edge of the firelight grew long and restless. She found herself waking in the night, heart pounding, certain that someone, or something, was watching from the darkness beyond the window. One evening, as the family sat around the table, a knock sounded at the door. John opened it to find an old woman standing on the threshold, her hair white as bone and her eyes sharp as flint. She introduced herself as Widow Harker, a name that sent a ripple of unease through Martha. The widow had lived in the county longer than anyone, and her memory stretched back to the days before the vanishing. She accepted a cup of coffee and sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around the mug. "You've built your home on cursed ground," she said, her voice low and steady. "The land remembers what was done here." The preacher tried to warn them, but pride is a stubborn thing. She told them of the burial mounds, of the mask unearthed by greedy hands, and of the blackened hymnal found in the meeting house. "They woke something that should have been left to sleep," she said, "and the land took its due." John scoffed, but Martha listened, her unease growing. That night, she dreamed of the bluff, of hands reaching up from the earth, their fingers stained black. She woke with a scream, her nightgown damp with sweat, and found Sarah standing at the foot of the bed, her eyes wide and unblinking. "The singing woke me," the girl whispered. "It's coming from the stones." The next morning, Martha found a trail of small, muddy footprints leading from the door to the edge of the bluff. She followed them, her heart pounding, and found Sarah sitting in the grass, her hands buried in the soil. The girl looked up, her face pale, and her eyes distant. "They're cold," she said. "They want to come inside." Martha dragged her daughter back to the cabin and locked the door, her hands shaking. She told John what had happened, but he dismissed it as a child's fancy. Still, he agreed to keep the children close, and for a time, the family tried to ignore the unease that crept into their home. But the land would not be ignored. The well soured, the milk curdled, and the chickens stopped laying. At night, the wind carried the sound of singing thin and mournful, rising from the bluff. The children woke screaming, their dreams filled with shadows and voices. Martha found herself praying, her words desperate and hollow, as if the God she called upon could not hear her across the distance of this cursed place. One evening, as the sun set behind the bluff, John went to fetch water from the well. He did not return. Martha found the bucket lying in the grass, the rope snapped and the water spilled. There were no footprints, no sign of struggle, only the silence, heavy and absolute. She searched the prairie until her voice was hoarse, but the only answer was the wind and the distant mocking song from the stones. The townsfolk came to help, but they found nothing. They whispered of the curse, of the land taking what it was owed. Widow Harker stood at the edge of the bluff, her face grim. "It's begun again," she said, "the land remembers." Martha packed what she could and fled with her children, leaving the cabin to the grass and the wind. She never spoke of what happened, but her hair turned white within the year, and her eyes never lost their haunted look. The McRae homestead joined the others, sinking into ruin, another scar on the land. And so the bluff remained, silent and watchful, its secrets buried beneath the soil. The story of the vanishing grew, fed by fear and loss, a warning to those who would not listen. The land waited, patient and hungry, for the next to forget. The prairie's hush deepened as the years slipped by, and the bluff's shadow stretched longer with each retelling of the story. The McCrae family's flight became another chapter in the legend, and the land around Devil's Nest Bluff was left to the wild things and the wind. The grass grew so high it swallowed the old fence posts, and the cabins collapsed into heaps of gray timber, their roofs caved in, and their hearths choked with weeds. The only visitors were crows, who gathered in the bare trees and watched the stones with bright, unblinking eyes. But the story would not die. In the spring of 1875, a school teacher named Miss Lydia Harrow arrived in Keokuk County. She was young and determined, with a mind sharpened by books and a heart that yearned for adventure. She had heard the tales of the bluff, of the vanished settlers and the preacher's warning, but she believed in reason and the power of knowledge. She took a room in the town's boarding house and began to ask questions, her curiosity stirring up old fears among the townsfolk. Miss Harrow visited the county's oldest residents, listening to their stories and taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal. She learned of the preacher's arrival, of the storm that swept through the settlement, and of the strange black liquid that stained the torn hymnal. She heard of the burial mounds, the unearthed mask, and the diary found beneath the floorboards. Each account was different in its details, but all shared the same undercurrent of dread, a sense that something had been awakened, something that would not rest. Determined to see the place for herself, Miss Harrow set out one morning with a satchel of supplies and her journal. The walk to the bluff was long and lonely, the prairie stretching out in all directions, the sky vast and empty. As she approached the ruins, the air grew still, and the birds fell silent. She paused at the edge of the old settlement, her heart pounding, and surveyed the scene. The cabins were little more than piles of rotting wood, the grass grown up around them like a shroud. The stones of the burial mounds were half hidden, their shapes softened by time and weather. She knelt beside the largest mound, brushing away the grass with careful hands. The earth was cool and damp, and as she dug, her fingers closed around something hard and smooth. She pulled it free, a bead of red stone, worn and pitted, its surface etched with strange, looping symbols. She turned it over in her palm, feeling a chill run up her spine. The bead seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, as if it remembered the hands that had shaped it centuries before. Miss Harrow made her way to the bluff, her steps slow and cautious. The limestone cliffs loomed above her, their faces streaked with black and gray. At their base, she found the circle of stones, now almost swallowed by the grass. In the center, the earth was bare, the soil dark and loose. She knelt again, her breath coming in short, nervous bursts, and pressed her hand to the ground. The earth was cold, colder than it should have been, and she felt a faint vibration, as if something deep below was stirring. She opened her journal and began to sketch the scene, her pencil trembling in her hand. As she worked, the wind picked up, swirling around her in sudden, fitful gusts. The grass bent and whispered, and the crows took flight, their cries sharp and urgent. Miss Harrow looked up, her heart racing, and saw a figure standing at the edge of the bluff, a tall, thin man in a black coat, his face hidden in shadow. She called out, but the figure did not move. He stood perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She gathered her things and hurried back toward the settlement, glancing over her shoulder. The figure remained, unmoving, until she was nearly out of sight. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he raised his hand and pointed toward the burial mounds. Miss Harrow returned to town shaken, her mind racing with questions. She told no one of what she had seen, but that night, she dreamed of the bluff, of hands reaching up from the earth, of voices singing in a language she could not understand, of a mask with empty eyes staring into her soul. She woke before dawn, her sheets tangled and damp with sweat, and found the red bead on her nightstand, though she was certain she had left it in her satchel. The next day, she visited the town's small library, searching for any mention of the symbols on the bead. She found nothing in the county records, nothing in the old newspapers, but in a battered volume of native legends, she found a story that chilled her to the bone. It spoke of a spirit bound to the earth, a guardian of the dead whose mask must never be disturbed. Those who broke the covenant would be claimed by the land, their names erased, their souls lost to the wind. Miss Harrow closed the book with trembling hands. She understood now what the preacher had tried to warn them about, what the settlers had awakened when they dug into the mounds. The land was not empty. It was waiting, patient and watchful, for those who would not listen. That night, as she lay in bed, the wind rose, carrying with it the faint sound of singing from the direction of the bluff. The melody was old and mournful, and it seemed to seep into her bones, filling her with a dread she could not name. She pressed the bead to her chest and prayed, her words lost in the darkness. The land remembered. And it was not done. The days that followed were restless for Miss Harrow. She found herself glancing over her shoulder as she walked the muddy streets of town, her mind haunted by the memory of the figure on the bluff and the cold, pulsing bead she kept hidden in her pocket. The townsfolk noticed her unease and began to avoid her, whispering that she had spent too long among the ruins, that the land's curse had found her. She tried to dismiss their fears, but the sense of being watched never left her. At night, she dreamed of the prairie, of endless grass and blackened stones, of voices singing in the wind. Determined to understand what she had found, Miss Harrow wrote a letter to a professor at the state university, enclosing a careful drawing of the bead symbols. She described the events at Devil's Nest Bluff, omitting only the most fantastic details, and asked for any information about the burial mounds or the legends of the land. She sent the letter with the weekly stagecoach and waited, her nerves stretched thin by the silence that seemed to press in from all sides. While she waited, she returned to her research, piecing together the fragments of the settler's story. She visited the old church where the preacher's name was still carved into the pews, and spoke with Widow Harker, who remembered the hymns sung on the night before the vanishing. The widow's voice was thin and trembling, but her eyes were sharp. "He tried to save them," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "But the land was hungry. It always has been." Miss Harrow copied passages from Abigail Finch's diary, her fingers tracing the faded ink. She read of the preacher's warnings, of the unease that crept into the settlement, of the night the mask was unearthed. The diary's last pages were nearly illegible, the words scrawled in panic. "The wind is singing, the dogs are silent, something is coming." She wondered what Abigail had seen, what had driven her to such terror. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the bluff, Miss Harrow returned to the ruins. She moved quietly, her footsteps muffled by the thick grass. The air was heavy, the sky bruised with the threat of rain. She knelt by the largest mound, pressing her palm to the earth. The ground was cold, and she felt again the faint vibration, as if something deep below was stirring. She whispered a prayer, not knowing to whom she spoke, and left the bead on the mound, hoping to appease whatever spirit lingered there. As she turned to leave, she heard a soft, shuffling sound behind her. She spun, heart pounding, and saw a figure standing among the ruins. It was a man, tall and thin, his face hidden in shadow. He wore a black coat, its edges tattered and stained. In his hands, he held a hymnal, its pages torn and soaked with a dark, oily liquid. He raised his head, and for a moment, Miss Harrow saw his eyes, empty, black as the soil, reflecting nothing but the endless prairie. She stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. The figure did not move, did not speak. He simply watched her, the hymnal clutched to his chest. The wind rose, carrying the faint sound of singing, and the grass bent low around the mounds. Miss Harrow turned and fled, not stopping until she reached the edge of town, her lungs burning and her heart racing. That night she locked her door and shuttered her windows, but the singing found her all the same. It seeped through the walls, a thin, mournful melody that wound its way into her dreams. She saw the preacher, his face gaunt and hollow, his hands stained black. She saw the settlers, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. She saw the mask, its features twisted and empty, its eyes staring into the darkness. When morning came, Miss Harrow found the bead on her nightstand once more, its surface slick with dew. She wrapped it in a scrap of cloth and hid it in her trunk, determined to rid herself of it as soon as she could. She resolved to leave Keokuk County, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the Bluff. But as she packed her things, a letter arrived from the university. The professor's reply was brief and cautious. He recognized the symbols as belonging to an ancient Algonquian dialect, used in burial rites to bind spirits to the earth. The bead, he wrote, was likely a talisman, meant to protect the living from the restless dead. Such objects should not be disturbed, he warned. To do so is to invite the attention of things best left forgotten. Miss Harrow read the letter twice, her hands trembling. She understood now the weight of what she had found, the danger she had brought upon herself. She left the bead on the church altar, hoping that some measure of grace might linger there, and boarded the next stagecoach out of town. As the wheels rattled over the prairie, she looked back at the Bluff, its shadow long and dark against the sky. The land was silent, but she knew it was watching. The story of Devil's Nest Bluff was not finished. The earth remembered, and the dead were not at rest. And somewhere, beneath the grass and the stones, the singing continued, waiting for the next to listen. The prairie summer of 1876 was a season of drought. The grass withered to brittle stalks and the creeks shrank to muddy trickles. The people of Keokuk County grew gaunt and irritable, their tempers as short as the water supply. Yet even as the land cracked and the crops failed, no one dared draw water from the old well near Devil's Nest Bluff. The memory of vanished families and the preacher's warning was too fresh, the fear too deeply rooted. The bluff itself seemed to shimmer in the heat, its limestone face streaked with black, its shadow stretching across the fields like a wound. It was during this dry, desperate summer that a group of railroad men arrived, their surveyors' flags and iron tools gleaming in the sun. They were a rough lot, used to hard work and harder living, and they scoffed at the townsfolk's warnings. The railroad would bring progress, they said, and progress had no patience for old superstitions. Their foreman, a broad-shouldered man named O'Malley, set up camp near the edge of the abandoned settlement, his men eager to lay track through the wildest part of the county. The first days passed without incident. The men worked from dawn to dusk, driving stakes and measuring distances, their laughter echoing across the empty prairie. At night, they gathered around their fire, swapping stories and drinking cheap whiskey. But as the days wore on, a sense of unease crept into the camp. Tools went missing, only to be found later, blackened and cold to the touch. The men complained of strange dreams, of singing in the wind, of hands reaching up from the earth, of a mask with hollow eyes watching from the shadows. O'Malley dismissed their fears, blaming the heat and the whiskey. But even he could not ignore the way the dogs whined and refused to go near the bluff, or the way the grass seemed to twist and writhe in the moonlight. One night, as the men sat around the fire, a sudden gust of wind swept through the camp, scattering embers and sending a chill through the air. The singing began then, faint and mournful, rising from the direction of the bluff. The men fell silent, their faces pale in the firelight. The next morning, one of the men was missing. His bedroll was undisturbed, his boots neatly placed by the fire. The only sign of him was a trail of blackened footprints leading toward the bluff. The grass along the path wilted and dead. O'Malley organized a search, but the men found nothing. No body, no sign of struggle, only the endless prairie and the silent watching stones. The railroad men grew restless, their work slowing as fear took hold. Some refused to go near the bluff, while others muttered about curses and vengeful spirits. O'Malley tried to keep order, but each night the singing returned, growing louder and more insistent. The men began to see shapes moving among the ruins, tall, thin figures with empty eyes, their faces hidden in shadow. The dogs howled and snapped at the air, their fur bristling with terror. On the seventh night, a storm rolled in, lightning flashing over the prairie, thunder shaking the earth. The men huddled in their tents, listening to the wind howl and the singing rise above the storm. When morning came, the camp was in chaos. 2 more men were gone, their belongings left behind, their footprints ending at the edge of the bluff. The others refused to stay another night, packing their things and leaving the rails unfinished, the iron tracks ending abruptly in the tall grass. O'Malley was the last to leave. He stood at the edge of the bluff, staring into the darkness below, his face drawn and haunted. He left behind his journal, a battered notebook filled with careful notes and rough sketches. In its final pages, his handwriting grew frantic, the words scrawled in desperation. "The land is hungry. The singing will not stop. We should not have come here." The journal was found weeks later by a local boy who brought it to Widow Harker. She read the pages in silence, her face pale and her hands trembling. She added the journal to her collection of relics from the bluff: Abigail Finch's diary, the torn hymnal, the bead wrapped in cloth. She kept them in a wooden box beneath her bed, a private shrine to the vanished and the lost. The drought broke at last, rain falling in sheets across the prairie. The grass grew tall and green, the creeks filled, and the people of Keokuk County breathed easier. But the land around Devil's Nest Bluff remained untouched, the grass there always a little too long, the air always a little too still. The railroad never came, the tracks rusting in the weeds, a monument to progress halted by something older and stronger than iron. Widow Harker grew old and frail, her memory fading, but she never forgot the stories. She warned the children to stay away from the bluff, to leave the dead to their rest. She told them of the preacher's warning, of the settlers who vanished, of the singing that rose from the stones. And sometimes, when the wind was right, she would sit by her window and listen, her eyes fixed on the distant bluff, her lips moving in silent prayer. The land remembered. The dead were not at rest. And the singing continued, a mournful echo of all that had been lost, waiting for the next to listen. The years slipped by, and the world beyond Keokuk County changed. Railroads found other routes, and the county's towns grew slowly, their streets lined with new brick and painted wood. Yet the land around Devil's Nest Bluff remained untouched, a patch of wildness in a tamed world. The grass grew thick and tangled, the stones of the old mounds sinking deeper each spring. The cabins were gone, their timbers rotted and carried off by storms, but the stories lingered, passed from parent to child, from neighbor to stranger. In the autumn of 1882, a young minister named Thomas Lyle arrived in Keokuk County. He was fresh from seminary, his faith untested, his mind filled with the certainty of Scripture. He came to take up the pulpit at the small white church, eager to bring order and hope to a congregation worn thin by years of hardship. The townsfolk welcomed him politely, but he soon noticed the way their eyes slid away from the north, the way their voices dropped when the bluff was mentioned. Curious, Lyle asked about the stories. He was told of the vanished settlers, the preacher who warned of devils, the railroad men who fled in terror. He listened, but he did not believe. Superstition, he said, is the enemy of faith. He resolved to visit the bluff himself, to see the place that had so frightened his flock. On a gray October morning, Lyle set out alone, his Bible tucked under his arm. The air was cold and still, the sky low and heavy. He followed the old wagon road, now little more than a pair of ruts in the grass, until he reached the edge of the wild patch. The land felt different here, older, heavier, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He pressed on, his boots sinking into the soft ground, until he stood at the base of the limestone cliffs. The stones of the burial mounds were nearly hidden by grass, but Lyle found them, tracing their outlines with his foot. He knelt and prayed, his voice steady, asking for peace for the restless dead and for wisdom to guide the living. As he prayed, the wind rose, carrying with it a faint, mournful singing. Lyle paused, listening, his heart pounding. The melody was strange, older than any hymn he knew, and it seemed to come from the earth itself. He stood and opened his Bible, reading aloud from the Psalms. The singing grew louder, swirling around him, the words indistinct but filled with sorrow. Lyle's voice faltered, and he felt a chill creep up his spine. He closed the Bible and turned to leave, but the grass seemed to clutch at his feet. and the air grew thick and hard to breathe. Suddenly, the sky darkened, and a cold rain began to fall. Lyle stumbled back toward the road, the singing following him, growing sharper, more insistent. He glanced over his shoulder and saw shapes moving among the stones, tall, thin figures with hollow eyes, their faces hidden in shadow. He ran, the Bible clutched to his chest, not stopping until he reached the safety of the church. That night, Lyle could not sleep. The singing echoed in his mind, and his dreams were filled with visions of the bluff, of hands reaching up from the earth, of faces twisted in grief, of a mask with empty eyes staring into the darkness. He woke before dawn, his sheets damp with sweat, and found his Bible on the floor, its pages stained with a black, oily liquid. He tried to speak of what he had seen, but the townsfolk only shook their heads. "We warned you," they said. "Some things are best left alone." Lyle grew withdrawn, his sermons growing darker, filled with warnings of pride and the dangers of disturbing the dead. He spent his days in the church, praying and reading, his eyes always drifting to the north, to the place where the land remembered. One evening, as the sun set behind the bluff, Lyle heard a knock at the church door. He opened it to find an old woman standing in the shadows, her hair white and her eyes sharp. She introduced herself as Widow Harker, and she carried a wooden box wrapped in a faded shawl. She placed the box on the altar and opened it, revealing the relics of the vanished. Abigail Finch's diary, the torn hymnal, the bead wrapped in cloth, and O'Malley's battered journal. "These are the memories of the bluff," she said. "They are all that is left of those who vanished. You must keep them safe. The land is hungry, and it will not rest until its secrets are kept." Lyle nodded, his hands trembling as he touched the relics. He felt the weight of the past settle on his shoulders, heavy and cold. He locked the box in the church's small safe, but he knew it was not enough. The singing still came at night, rising from the stones, calling out to those who would listen. As winter settled over Keokuk County, Lyle grew thin and pale, his eyes haunted by what he had seen. He wrote long letters to distant friends, describing the curse of the bluff, the vanished settlers, the restless dead. Few replied, and those who did urged him to leave, to seek a new parish far from the haunted land. But Lyle could not go. He felt bound to the place, tied to its sorrow by a thread he could not break. The land around Devil's Nest Bluff remained wild and empty, the grass growing ever taller, the stones sinking deeper. The stories lingered whispered in the dark, a warning to those who would not listen. And always, beneath the wind and the rain, the singing continued, a mournful echo of all that had been lost, waiting for the next to hear. The winter of 1882 was long and bitter, the kind that pressed the world into silence and made every shadow seem deeper. Reverend Lyle kept to his routines, but the weight of the relics in the church safe grew heavier with each passing week. He found himself drawn to the box, unlocking it late at night to read the faded diary, to run his fingers over the bead, to stare at the torn, blackened hymnal. The words of Abigail Finch haunted him most. "The wind is singing. The dogs are silent. Something is coming." He read the line over and over, searching for meaning, for a way to break the cycle that bound the land to its sorrow. The congregation noticed the change in him. His sermons grew more urgent, his eyes hollow and rimmed with sleeplessness. He spoke of humility, of the dangers of pride, of the need to respect the boundaries between the living and the dead. Some parishioners whispered that the new preacher had gone mad, that the curse of the bluff had claimed him as it had claimed the others. Others simply stopped coming, leaving the church half empty on Sundays, the pews cold and silent. One night, as a blizzard howled outside, Lyle sat alone in the church, the box of relics open before him. The wind rattled the windows and the old building creaked and groaned. He lit a single candle and began to read Abigail's diary aloud, his voice trembling. As he read, the wind seemed to die away, replaced by a low, mournful singing that rose from the floorboards, from the very stones of the church itself. The candle flickered, and the shadows on the walls twisted and danced. Lyle's voice faltered, but he forced himself to continue. He read of the preacher's arrival, of the storm, of the night the mask was unearthed. He read of the fear that crept into the settlement, of the dreams that haunted the children, of the singing that would not stop. As he reached the final entry, the singing grew louder, filling the church with a sound that was both beautiful and terrible. The candle guttered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence that followed, Lyle heard footsteps, soft, shuffling, coming from the back of the church. He turned, heart pounding, and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a woman, her hair long and tangled, her dress torn and stained. Her eyes were empty, black as the soil, and her mouth moved in time with the singing. Lyle tried to speak, but no sound came. The woman raised her hand, pointing toward the box of relics, and the singing swelled, filling the church with a cold, suffocating dread. Lyle fell to his knees, clutching the box to his chest. He prayed, his words desperate and broken, begging for forgiveness, for mercy, for the dead to be at peace. The singing faded, replaced by a silence so deep it seemed to press the air from his lungs. When he looked up, the woman was gone, and the church was empty once more. He locked the box in the safe and fled into the storm, the snow stinging his face, the wind howling in his ears. He wandered the streets of the sleeping town, his mind racing, his heart pounding. He knew now that the curse could not be broken, that the land would never forget what had been done. The dead were restless, their voices rising from the stones, calling out for justice, for remembrance, for peace. The next morning, Lyle was found at the edge of the bluff, his coat dusted with snow, his eyes wide and unseeing. He was alive, but he would not speak, would not move, would not respond to the voices of those who tried to rouse him. The townsfolk carried him back to the church, laying him in the small room behind the altar. Widow Harker sat with him, her old hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the distant bluff. "He has seen them," she said quietly. "He has heard the singing. The land has marked him." The church was closed, its doors barred, the box of relics left untouched in the safe. The townsfolk avoided the building, crossing themselves as they passed, whispering prayers for the preacher and for the souls of the vanished. The story of Devil's Nest Bluff grew darker, the details blurred by fear and time. Some said the preacher had gone mad, others that he had been claimed by the spirits of the land. But all agreed that the singing still rose from the stones on cold, windy nights, a warning to those who would not listen. As spring returned, the grass grew tall and green around the bluff, hiding the stones and the scars of the past. The land seemed peaceful, but the memory of what had happened lingered, a shadow that would not lift. Children dared each other to spend a night near the bluff, but none were brave enough to try. The dogs still refused to go near, their hackles rising, their eyes fixed on the place where the earth remembered. Widow Harker grew weaker, her hair thin and white, her voice little more than a whisper. She spent her days by the window, watching the bluff, her lips moving in silent prayer. She knew the story was not finished, that the land was still hungry, still waiting. She kept the key to the church safe on a ribbon around her neck, a small comfort against the darkness that pressed in from the prairie. And always, when the wind was right, the singing could be heard, rising from the stones, calling out to the living and the dead. The land remembered. The dead were not at rest. And the story of Devil's Nest Bluff waited, patient and unresolved, for the next to listen. The years that followed blurred together, as if the land itself wished to forget. Widow Harker passed quietly one spring morning, her hands folded over the key to the church safe, her eyes closed as if she were only sleeping. The townsfolk buried her in the churchyard, beneath a crooked stone, and whispered that she had taken the last of the old stories with her. But the bluff remained, silent and watchful, its shadow stretching across the prairie, its secrets undisturbed. The church stood empty, its windows clouded with dust, its doors locked tight. Children dared each other to peer through the cracks, to glimpse the darkness within. But none lingered long. The box of relics, Abigail Finch's diary, the torn hymnal, the bead, the battered journal, remained sealed in the safe, gathering dust and silence. The key, found on a ribbon around Widow Harker's neck, was placed in the care of the town's new minister, a cautious man who kept it hidden in a drawer and never spoke of the Bluff. Yet the story would not die. On certain nights, when the wind shifted and the moon hung low, the singing could still be heard, faint and mournful, rising from the stones. Some said it was only the wind or the cry of a distant owl, but others knew better. The land remembered, and the dead were not at rest. In the summer of 1891, a group of surveyors arrived, sent by a distant company with plans to build a new road through the wild patch north of town. They were strangers, unfamiliar with the stories, and they set up camp near the edge of the bluff, their laughter echoing across the fields. The townsfolk watched from a distance, uneasy, but said nothing. They had learned that warnings were seldom heeded, and that the land would take its own revenge. The surveyors worked quickly, marking the ground with stakes and flags, measuring distances, drawing lines on their maps. The days were long and hot, the air thick with the scent of wildflowers and dust. At night, they gathered around their fire, telling stories of other places, other dangers. But as the week wore on, a sense of unease crept into their camp. Tools went missing only to be found later, blackened and cold. The men complained of strange dreams, of singing in the wind, of hands reaching up from the earth, of a mask with hollow eyes watching from the shadows. One evening, as the sun set behind the bluff, a young surveyor named Carter wandered away from the fire, drawn by a whispering voice that seemed to call his name. He found himself standing at the edge of the old burial mounds, the grass tall and tangled around his boots. The air was cold, and the sky had turned the color of bruised fruit. Carter knelt, brushing the grass aside, and saw the stones, half buried and worn smooth by time. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the earth. The singing rose, soft at first, then louder, swirling around him like a shroud. Carter tried to stand, but the ground seemed to hold him fast. He saw shapes moving among the stones, tall, thin figures with empty eyes, their faces hidden in shadow. He tried to scream, but no sound came. The last thing he saw was the mask, its features twisted and empty, its eyes staring into his soul. In the morning, the surveyors found Carter's boots at the edge of the bluff, his footprints leading into the grass and ending abruptly. The others packed their things and left, their faces pale, their voices hushed. The road was never built, and the wild patch remained, untouched and untamed. The town grew slowly, its people wary of the land to the north. The church was reopened, its pews filled with new faces, but the safe remained locked, the box of relics undisturbed. The new minister sometimes heard the singing at night, and he would rise from his bed and pray until dawn, his hands shaking, his heart heavy with dread. Years passed and the world changed. The prairie was tamed, the wild grass plowed under, the old stories fading into memory. But the bluff remained, a scar on the land, a place where the past lingered just beneath the surface. Travelers who strayed too close spoke of strange dreams, of voices in the wind, of a cold that seeped into their bones. Some returned with stories of lights flickering among the stones, of singing that would not stop, of faces glimpsed in the darkness. The relics in the church safe gathered dust, their secrets locked away. But sometimes, when the wind was right, the minister would find the safe ajar, the box open, the diary or the hymnal moved as if by unseen hands. He would close the box, lock the safe, and pray. But the sense of unease never left him. The land remembered, and the dead were not at rest. On the anniversary of the vanishing, the townsfolk gathered in the churchyard, lighting candles and whispering prayers for the lost. They spoke of the preacher who warned of devils, of the settlers who vanished, of the singing that rose from the stones. They told the story to their children, a warning and a lesson, a reminder that some secrets are best left buried. And always, beneath the wind and the rain, the singing continued, a mournful echo of all that had been lost, waiting for the next to listen. The land was patient. The land was hungry. The story of Devil's Nest Bluff was not finished. If you ever find yourself on the prairie, and the wind carries a song you do not know, remember the warning. Some stories don't stay buried, and some doors once opened can never be closed. If the wind ever feels wrong near a cliff, if silence clings a little too tightly to the ground, you might be closer to Devil's Nest than you think. So now it's your turn. What do you believe really happened that night in 1856? Was it a buried curse? A trespass too deep to forgive? Or something older still waiting patiently beneath the soil? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your theory might be closer to the truth than you realize. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Because in places like Keokuk County, the land remembers, and sanctified secrets never stay buried for long.